Joining me now on the Go Rhody podcast is Paul Knepper. He's the author of Knicks in the 90's, Ewing, Oakley, Starks, and the rest of the Brawlers, the team that almost won it all. How are you, Paul? Thanks for coming in.
I'm doing well. Sure. Thanks for having me on.
So, the 90's, we forgot to cover it. Is it because they didn't win a championship?
I think so. I mean, I think I think Michael Jordan and his Bulls suck up a lot of the oxygen when it comes to talking about 90s basketball. And yeah, they didn't win. The Knicks ultimately didn't win it. And so we tend to talk about the guys who did. And so I think they get a little lost in the shuffle for that reason.
I was doing a little research. There's only other two comparable decades, obviously the 70's, two championships. And then the 50's, their first 3 years, Joe Lapchick, what a name of the past. I don't know if you knew him. Definitely, I wasn't young enough for that team, but they made it to the finals the first 3 years and they lost each one. Do you believe that the 90's were the best decade?
Yeah, I mean the 70s have to be the best decade,
Really?
because as you said, they won it twice. Um, but the 90s was a great decade. Uh, Even more so than the 70s, but they were highly competitive, really title contenders throughout the whole decade. Whereas the 70s, you have to put them first because they won two championships, but by the mid 70s, the dynasty was over, if you want to call it dynasty. That the championship teams had, a few of the guys that retired, and the couple that were left were getting older. And the second half of that decade was not that, they were never really contenders at all throughout that whole period. So in a way, the 90s was a more sustained excellence in a way, even if they didn't get to that mountaintop as the 70s team did. And I would add that for, a lot of people like myself, I'm too young. I was born in 77, so I don't remember the 70s teams. And there's a whole generation or two of Knicks fans who grew up on those 90s teams were way too young or perhaps just too young to remember the 70s team. So that is for those fans, those 90s teams are their gold standard.
But at any rate, I also wanted to talk about what we're going to be doing today because this is so revealing what you've uncovered that I promise you, for those who are watching today, you will never look at the Knicks again the same way, for the good and for the bad. And we were established, and then who were the biggest fishes that you got, or fish, and that you didn't get?
Yeah, the two. I'll start with the two biggest I didn't get, and that was Pat Riley and Patrick Ewing. And I went into it knowing that Riley in particular was a real long shot because I've been told by other writers that he just doesn't do interviews anymore, and you
Why
can do the
is that?
research to confirm that. I
I,
don't know. I read at some point that he said, it was demanding on his time, and he was getting older, and if he was going to be able to continue to do the job, he had to kind of insulate himself somewhat from the media. I don't know. I don't fully understand.
yeah.
But even if you do a search, you could, you'll in the last 7, 8 years, maybe you'll find one or two interviews, and those are people who have had like long-standing relationships with him that he's agreed. So I knew that was highly unlikely. Ewing was coaching at Georgetown at the time, and so he was busy with that, and he also doesn't do a lot of interviews. I think maybe a little more accessible than Riley. So I knew he was a long shot, but a possibility, and it looked like it was going to happen, and then it didn't happen, and so it was disappointing. But the nice thing with both of those guys, Riley more so in his younger years, but they've done a lot of interviews, and so this is a few podcasts that Ewing had done, and you get great detail with that, and then of course you talk to tons of people who knew them in different ways, and you get that information in other ways. And then some of the guys I did get, Van Gundy, who's essential. Jeff Van Gundy, who's a central character in the book, was a great interview, very helpful. I talked to his brother Stan too, As far as coaches go, I talked to current Knicks coach Tom Thibideau, who was not
Yeah.
the Knicks coach then, but is now. He was an assistant coach with the Knicks at the end of the 90s under Jeff Van Gundy. And key players like John Starks, Charles Oakley, who were kind of cornerstones of those 90s teams, were great interviews as well.
That's a pretty good list, though. And it's a shame always you want to get that. The book may have been completely different if you did interview Pat Riley and Ewing, but you never know.
Yeah, you always want to get those. My experience too with doing other projects and interviews and articles is that in general, the bigger the name, the less they're going to give you.
Yeah.
It's almost like, for one, they're tired of doing interviews all over the years, so they develop kind of stock answers to a lot of the questions, and they're like, if you're a name, it's almost like you have something to lose, and they're not as likely to reveal more personal things.
What I wanted to talk about was the big story, which was we almost lost Ewing, didn't we?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. I don't know. I don't know. I was a little young at the time, and so I was vaguely aware of it, but I don't know how aware of it people were. The media landscape was very different then, and I don't know if people know how close it came or how much he wanted to leave. But he very much did want to leave in the summer of 1991. Patrick had been there 6 years at that point, and in those 6 years, the Knicks had gone through 5 coaches, 3 general managers. So a lot of player turnover, a lot of questionable decisions by management. And I think he looked around and was just like, he was approaching 30 years old. And I think he got the sense that I'm not competing for a championship here anytime soon. And that this franchise is somewhat dysfunctional. And, I want to go elsewhere where I think I'll have a better chance of winning. And so he tried to get out of his contract. There was a clause in his contract that if he was not among the top 5 highest paid players in the league, he could opt out of his contract and become a free agent. And he and his agent, David Falk, argued that that was the case. The Knicks argued otherwise. And even when the league ruled against Ewing and said you're not a free agent, he then demanded a trade and went so far as to give the Knicks a list of teams that he wanted to be traded to. And the Knicks called around. They had some talks. They explored possibilities. One which was fascinating to me. Dave Checketts, the team president, told me that he flew down to San Antonio and he offered Red McCombs, the owner of the Spurs, Patrick Ewing, and $10 million for David Robinson, which I'm pretty sure no one had ever reported that before, and that was fascinating to me.
That's what I'm saying. I told you that earlier in the podcast. This is going to startle some people. They're not going to look at the teams.
Yeah, I mean, that would have
news.
Right, that would have completely changed the landscape of the NBA throughout the 90s.
Would you have liked that trade? I wouldn't.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so. Robinson was a little younger and maybe slightly better. They're close. They were close, but it's hard. I mean, it's not a slam dunk by any means. I mean, Patrick was a warrior for the franchise for many years.
But then they had the Pat Riley Ewing Summit that I got from your book. I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah. So this is May of 1991, and the Knicks, Checketts had recently come in as president of the team, and he fired the general manager, he fired the coach, John McLeod, and he's looking for a new coach, and he kind of zeroed in on Pat Riley. Pat Riley had been working for NBC at the time. It had been like a year since he left the Lakers, and of course he had won 4 championships with the Lakers and was, regarded as one of, not probably the top coach in all of basketball. And so he and Checketts had been negotiating for a while, and finally Riley came to New York and checked into a hotel, and Checketts went up to the hotel and tried to hammer out the deal and finalize things. And Riley said to him, "I'm not signing on the dotted line unless I know that Ewing's going to be here." He had no interest in a rebuilding project. He wanted a superstar.
Yeah.
I don't blame him. And So at the same time, Ewing's at a different hotel on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and Checketts is shuttling back and forth between Riley and Ewing and kind of negotiating with both. And he's saying to Ewing, look, I got Pat Riley right here. He's going to come on board, this great coach, and we'll have direction and we'll have stability. But he wants to know that you're going to be here. And Ewing wouldn't make that commitment. And said he could go back to Riley, and Riley said, well, I'm not committing if Ewing's not committing. And ultimately, Checketts kind of laid down the law with both of them. He said to Ewing, he said, look, we have an extension offer on the table right now. You're going to lose your attempt to become free agent. You're not going to become a free agent. We're not going to trade you. And if you don't agree to stay now, you're going to lose this extension that we're offering. And he said to Riley, you have, and I don't know, he gave him a specific time, like 5 p.m. today. I can't tell you for certain that Patrick's going to be here. I'm confident he will. I believe you being on board will help convince him to stay, but I can't give you a guarantee. This is the offer. These are the final terms, and you have until 5 o'clock to accept or reject. And of course, Riley accepted. Riley met with Ewing, tried to get him on board. Ewing wasn't hearing it. He still wanted out. But in time, the Knicks didn't trade him, and they kept that extension on the table for him. And I think Riley kind of won him over somewhat too. And, the rest was history.
What a story that is. I wonder if Checketts had this planned. It's almost like Leon Rose. Like, I have to give Checketts a lot of credit if you look at his body of work. What do you think? I know you spoke with him too.
Yeah, I spoke to him. He certainly takes a lot of credit for it.
That's good. I'm glad. So revealing. That makes your book better.
Right. But no, he absolutely deserves credit. He brought in Riley. He had a relationship with Riley before, because Checketts had worked in the front office and he got to know Riley. So he absolutely brought in Riley. He did the right thing where he didn't sell low on Ewing, which he could have done. And that was a very challenging situation for a new executive, and he handled it extremely well. And he brought in Ernie Grunfeld to be GM, and Grunfeld did a really nice job. And I think Checketts deserves a lot of credit for the success that the team had in the 90s.
Yeah, and also Grunfeld as well, the players that he brought in.
Yeah.
Finding Starks, who was with the carts at Stop and Shop.
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's an urban legend or true, but he was some get, wasn't he?
Yeah. No, it's a true story. He was packing groceries.
Really?
I think it was a Piggly Wiggly. At Piggly Wiggly, he was packing groceries.
What a name!
Yeah, right.
Who's the marketing wizards that came up with that name? Moving on, right? And like I said, this was an incredible story. It wasn't just Ewing leaving, but the whole work that he did, and Riley not necessarily coming. It wasn't just such an easy thing. I think most people thought just you got Riley, and never thought Ewing was going to leave, and that was that. But you uncovered some gems in that. What about Riley as a kid? A lot of people don't understand. See him with his great expensive suits, and he had a little different childhood. Tell me about his childhood.
Yeah, Pat Riley, and I think guys who knew Pat Riley even when he was in the league knew the real Pat Riley. But the image with the Lakers, at some point he started slicking back his hair and wearing these Armani suits, and it was Hollywood, and he kind of bought in. He kind of admitted later on he bought into the mystique a little bit, and his ego got a little out of control, and he had this. He looked like a movie star. And he was appearing on the cover of Vogue magazine and getting paid, $30,000 to make, speaking appearances and all that kind of stuff. And but the reality was that was all veneer. Pat Riley was a hard-nosed, blue collar kid. That's how he grew up. He didn't grow up with much money at all. There was a time where he wore one pair of pants that he wore to school every day. And he got in a lot of fights as a kid. He was a tough guy. He was the kind of kid who hung out on the street corners and the pool halls. I mean, he was a hard scrabble kind of guy. And that's actually how he made his career in the NBA. He was kind of it wasn't on talent. He didn't have a great NBA career, but he stuck around for 7, 8 years. He was like 6'4", and he was like not really quick and athletic enough to play guard, but not really big enough to be a forward. And his greatest attribute was as a practice player. He just worked his butt off and scratched and clawed for every opportunity that he got. And so that he but the main image of him was as the Lakers coach, because as a player he was like the seventh, eighth man. Nobody really knew Pat Riley very well, the player. It was as coach that he made his name, and he developed that image. And then he comes to New York, and it was actually perfect for him, because the makeup of that team really reflected his character and his upbringing. Those Knicks teams were tough and physical, and they were ready to fight, quite literally.
But you're missing something that I really want to hear from you. What the incident when he was a kid with the pants?
Ah, yeah. So he used to try. He used to.
I read your book, so
Yeah, I know. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. He used to. It's a great story. He used to dry his pants in an oven, and he got like a burn mark on his pants, and he only had one pair of pants, so they looked ridiculous. But he had to go to school wearing the pants with the burn mark, and he didn't. Nobody really gave him any crap about it, because he was Pat Riley, and he would kick your ass. He was a tough guy.
that's true. I read that too. But he had to get to that point. His dad made him wasn't soft on him.
No, his dad was tough. His dad was an alcoholic. His dad had some anger issues, and but he raised his sons to be tough and to stand up for themselves. And he liked to say, sometimes in life you need to plant your feet, stand firm, and make a point about who you are. And that line stuck with Riley throughout his life. He's used it many times with his teams, um, and the great example of that is Pat used to go to the park and play ball with the other kids, and they would play football and basketball. And he was younger at that time, younger than most of the kids, and they beat him up. He'd get smacked around and beat up every day, and every day he'd come home crying. And one day he didn't come to the dinner table, and Riley Pat's father asked Pat's brother, "Where is Pat?" And he said, "Pat's in the garage. He won't come out. He's crying, and he gets beat up at the park every day." And the brother said, "Why do you make him go? Why do you make him go, Dad?" And he hates it there, and he gets beat up. And his dad said, he needs to learn to plant his feet, stand firm, and make a point about who he is. And eventually he did. He learned to fight back. And but that's how he grew up, and I think that mentality has kind of never left him.
Yeah, he's a same way with the Heat. I didn't really care for having him in Miami. I live in Miami because the girls just went, oh, they just loved the guy, and I was tired of hearing how handsome he was. I was jealous of that. But then another guy that you interviewed, Big Fish Guy, is Jeff Van Gundy. I love the way you describe him. Can you tell our viewers?
Yeah, you and I talked about it. I think it's that he's a mix between a mortician and a accountant or a banker. I forget now.
Doesn't matter.
A mix between a mortician and a banker or an accountant. He kind of I think it stood out, especially then, because back then a higher percentage of the coaches were ex-players. Jeff Van Gundy played college ball, but at a very low level. But more were guys who played in the NBA or very high Division I. Now with the analytics movement, you have more guys who look like Jeff Van Gundy and Tom Thibideau, and they don't look. Pat Riley looked like an athlete, even well after his playing days. He was 6'4", broad shoulders, thin, handsome. Van Gundy looked like a schlub. He looked like an accountant, and he didn't. His suits were often ruffled, and he just didn't really care about that aspect of it. And even if he did, I couldn't present himself as an athletic type figure. And so it was a bit startling at that time, especially. And I think even adding on to that was that it was New York, and New York is, you're the head coach of the New York Knicks. This is, esteemed franchise and you look like an accountant. Like it just didn't, the image didn't fit. I think initially some people had a little difficulty accepting that.
Right.
But he won over, he won over Knicks fans. First thing he won over was the players. The players, because he'd been an assistant coach there for a long time, they were familiar with him. They had confidence in his ability as a coach and his ability to prepare them to play their best. And so that went a long way in getting him the job. And then he went over the fans with his work ethic. The joke was always that he had bags under his eyes, and I always say those bags became a badge of honor for him because you started to read the stories about how he didn't go home at night. He'd just sleep on the couch in his office because he was just watching film, or preparing 18 hours a day. And you're like, all right, this guy is obsessed with as obsessed with the Knicks winning as I am. And fans came to appreciate that. And, New York, it's interesting because there's so much money there, especially now, and even when you go, like the seats are so expensive. So you go to the Garden, most of the fans are relatively wealthy, but still fashion themselves like blue collar, hardworking people. And maybe they're not blue collar necessarily, but they still appreciate a work ethic. And Van Gundy demonstrated that. And I think that won a lot of the fans over. But there was also kind of an underdog aspect to him because he wasn't a big name. He wasn't a college coach. He didn't look like a coach. And everybody loves an underdog. And then lastly, and most importantly, is they were winning. The Knicks were winning. And if you're winning, that's all the fans care about ultimately.
Now, why was he so fond of Alonzo Mourning's leg in the brawl? I never found that out. What was the reasoning? What was the purpose of that?
So that was 98 when Alonzo Mourning and Larry Johnson got in a big fight. And according to Van Gundy, which no one knew at the time, and even years later, I think, until years later when Van Gundy talked about it, he ran out there very innocently, as others did, to break up the fight and try to pull people apart. And Mourning and Johnson are throwing punches while people are trying to hold them back. And Larry Johnson actually grazed Van Gundy's temple with a punch. He actually caught him with a punch. I don't know if it was squarely or just kind of grazed him, whatever. But Larry Johnson was, 6'7", 250 pounds, and pretty jacked. So even just grazing a man of Van Gundy's size is going to do some damage. And according to Van Gundy, he kind of dropped. He was dazed. The blow knocked him down, and he was kind of dazed and lying on the floor with people kind of stomping on him and all around him. And so he, being helpless and dazed, he grabbed onto whatever he could, and it happened to be Alonzo's leg.
Maybe that's what gained him the respect. A guy of his size compared to Mourning and almost taking him on. It didn't look like he was trying to win in a fight. He was more of a peacemaker. How did they become such a perennial power? I'm going to start you off with this. And this sounds way off, but what do you think about Bernard King's injury? Do you think that had an impact on the Knicks? And I'll tell you because they got the lottery pick.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think they were having a really rough year when Bernard went down and probably would have been in the lottery anyway. For a lot of people, the what if they didn't get hurt and won the lot? What if Bernard didn't get hurt and they won the lottery and you could have paired a healthy Bernard with Patrick? And I know those two have talked about what it would have been like to play together. Yeah.
I have to think about that afterwards because
So I don't remember the exact date, but it might have been like February when Bernard tore up his knee. And so they were well into the season and had a really bad record. Before that, they had other injuries. It was just kind of, that season just kind of went off the rails even before Bernard got hurt. So they probably would have still been in the lottery even if Bernard didn't get injured.
They would have been 94.
So I mean,
that's championship.
Yeah.
Looking at the roster.
Yeah, probably. I mean, there's Yeah, to pair him and Patrick together. I mean, that was always Patrick. Never played with another superstar. He never. I think the best collection of talent Patrick played with was towards the very end of his tenure with the Knicks, like the '99 team when he had Sprewell and Allen Houston and Larry Johnson and Marcus Camby, because I think, and at that point he was diminished. He was past his prime and his body was breaking down. Because I think in those prime years in, 93, 94, I think the big thing they were missing was another guy who could give you 20 points every night and on a consistent basis. And Starks would do it sometimes, and then sometimes he would shoot. He shot the greatest example. He shot 2 for 18 in Game 7 of the finals.
I get to that too.
Yeah, but that was Starks. He was actually Pat Riley nicknamed Starks Feast or Famine.
Really?
Yeah, that was his nickname for Starks, Feast or Famine, which tells you everything about Starks. And I love Starks, and he did wonders for that team, and he was an all-star that year they went to the finals. But he was Feast or Famine, and you need a guy who is just going to help you eat well every night. You need that guy. You need a second guy, like I said, who can give you 20 points. If Patrick's not feeling it, or if teams just double and triple team him all the time, you need another guy who could come up and give you a consistent 20 and sometimes give you 30, but you could count on to knock down that open shot, especially at the guard position, because Patrick was double teamed a lot, and there was those openings where he would kick it out, and
Yeah.
you didn't have that guy who night after night was going to just knock down the shot. And so the idea of pairing him with a guy, Bernard's next level. Forget 20 a game. He'll give you 30 a game. To have two guys like that could score at that level would have been just a devastating combination.
There was a little foreshadowing in your interviews. You heard Pat Riley say something before Game 7 to one of his friends about John Starks.
Yeah, I love that detail. That might have been my favorite detail that I got through research, because just how it played out, and that's a guy named Dick Butera, who he's a real estate developer in Colorado, and he had told me how he and Pat met up and became friends, but however it was, they became good friends over the years, to the point that Pat invited him to come hang out with him during the finals. And they were together in the hotel room, in Pat's hotel room, the day of Game 7, and about to leave. And as they're about to go down the elevator to exit the hotel to go to the arena for Game 7, Riley says to Butera, "Well, buddy, I know 2 guys are going to show up today, me and John." And he was that confident in Starks. It's very interesting. I talk about this in the book, that Starks, he actually once said Starks is the player he's coached who reminds him most of himself.
Wow.
Yeah, he saw Starks because Starks also had a very difficult upbringing, probably more so than Riley even, in terms of poverty, and a guy who didn't have the most talent in the league, but scratched and clawed for every opportunity, and just was always ready to fight for playing time, fight for shots, fight if you got in his face with his fists. He was always ready to go, and he reminded Riley a lot of himself, and maybe Riley had a little too much faith in Starks because of that.
And maybe we'll argue over this. I think when you get to 2 for 18, maybe when you're at 2 for 10, there weren't that many options. That was the weakness of the team. They weren't a great shooting team, especially from 3-point land. But who knows? I know Rolando Blackman, you had said in your book he hadn't played in a long time. Maybe Derek Harper, he's not a bad shooter from 3. Maybe bring in Hubert Davis. I don't know where he was at that time. Or Greg Anthony. But what's your thought on that? Did he make a mistake, Pat Riley? It's easy now. It always happens. It's going to happen again. Another coach is going to have a guy shoot 2 for 18 or something like that.
Yeah, he was shooting horribly, and he just kept shooting, and they kept missing, and he shot them out of the game. He kind of single-handedly shot them out of the game in Game 7. And people, you had Rolando Blackman on the bench who scored about, I think, about 20,000 points in his career. Rolando Blackman made a couple all-star teams. He was a really good player for a long time and had a really good career. And so people were like, well, you got this guy on the bench, just bring him in and, see what he could do. Hubert Davis is another option. Hubert I think it was Hubert's second year, and had some really nice moments during the season and really nice stretches, and was a hell of a three-point shooter. I mean, that was his specialty. I could argue that was all he could do, but he could do it. And I had a fascinating interview I talked to Hubert and Rolando about it.
There's a lot of people you got to.
Yeah. Hubert had a great perspective on it, and I was very surprised. He was very humble, and he said I wasn't ready. Wow. He said I played earlier in the postseason, and I was overwhelmed by the moment, and I wasn't ready to compete in a game of that magnitude, which was, I give him a lot of credit for admitting that. I think most athletes with their egos wouldn't. I don't know. I don't know if he believed that at the time or in retrospect, but he now believes that he was overwhelmed by the moment. And so I'm sure Riley sensed that. The Blackman thing is trickier because he was not overwhelmed by the moment. Blackman was a tremendous professional who was always prepared. My big thing with Blackman was a couple of things. He was a severely diminished player by that time. He never played another NBA game. He walked away after that. He knew he was done. Blackman hurt his back in his first preseason with the Knicks and was never physically the same after that. And my last point would be there were plenty of games where John Starks was 0 for 8 or 2 for 10, and you're like, this guy's having a horrible night, and then he would hit 5 in a row. He could do that.
Yeah.
So I think Riley looked at him too and like, this is a guy who got us here. He's probably our second most important player. He was an all-star this year. There were games even in this series where he almost won game 6 by himself in the fourth quarter. And I think Riley was like, well, at any time he could get going and flip the switch and go from shooting us out of the game to winning the game. Yeah, I mean, I think in the 90s it was somewhat complicated. They never had a great salary cap situation where they could sign that guy outright. And I think people forget too that the marquee players didn't move around nearly as much then as they do now. Contracts were a lot longer. There was some kind of sense of loyalty. The great players, when you look at the great players of that era, the 80s and 90s, they tended to stick with one team.
What was your most memorable moment?
My favorite moment, they're both 1993 against the Bulls. And my favorite moment is the John Starks dunk, known to Knicks fans just as the dunk. I had the poster on my wall for years as a kid, the dunk poster, and I know other people who had that poster. It was a majestic dunk. It was an incredible dunk, and it was over Michael Jordan, which was not just exciting, but there was a symbolism to that, which is, for years the Knicks had tried to be getting past Chicago. Chicago is the team you had to beat, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't get over the hump. And that dunk really sealed game 2 of that Eastern Conference Finals, which put the Knicks up 2-0 in the Eastern Conference Finals. And there was a sense that dunk, that emphatic exclamation point, was the sound of the Knicks passing the Bulls by. That this was it. That symbolized a passing of the torch. We're getting over the hump. We're beating this team. And so it was just a feeling of ecstasy. And then a few games later, of course, Chicago won game 3 and game 4. And then game 5 is back at the Garden, and the same place as the Starks dunk. And the Knicks are down 1 in the final seconds. And this is the worst moment. As Charles Smith gets rejected 4 times in a matter of 4 seconds or whatever it was. The Knicks lose the game, and that ecstasy was suddenly replaced by stunned silence. It was that feeling that we got over the hump, and we're finally going to beat them. Just in that one sequence came crashing down, and oh my God, we're falling short again. We're going to lose to them again. And because that season too in '93, the Knicks had the better record. The Knicks were the 1 seed. They had home court advantage in that Eastern Conference series. So they went up 2-0 with the understanding that even if they came back and there would be a game 7 would be in Madison Square Garden, and then the Knicks really liked their chances, the fans liked their chances, and then to lose game 5 like that and in that fashion was just devastating.
Who was guarding Charles Smith? That was my least favorite too, and I still feel he was fouled, but I understand you watched the videotape. And
yeah, I watched it in slow-mo a number of times.
Go by your word, but
yeah, I don't think he was. I don't think he was. A lot of people feel he agree with you. I don't think he was. But I always say it was, he was rejected 4 times, and it was by Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Horace Grant were the 3 culprits. And I consider Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen 2 of the greatest defenders that have ever lived. And Horace Grant was an all-defensive player himself, one of the best defensive big men of his generation. And so it was 3 great players making a sequence of great plays. There's some blame that lies on Charles Smith's shoulders as well. He didn't go up strong. He should have went up and tried to dunk the ball. And definitely, if he did get fouled, it would have been, if you believe he got fouled, it would have been more obvious, more blatant if he had gone on strong. And if you think he didn't get fouled, he likely would have gotten fouled had he gone up strong. So he deserves some blame for that. I think he's gotten way too much blame for that.
Definitely got a lot of blame.
It's not fair how the fan base has treated him and come down on him for that. He's like I said, that play, it's come to represent a lot more than the play itself, just what it was. And there's a whole lot of stuff piled on top of that is unfair. And the biggest thing is the Knicks missed 15 free throws in that game. 15 free throws for a professional team. Okay, if they had missed just 12 free throws instead of 15, they win that game.
Missing those free throws.
It was everybody. It was just everyone. It was just like collective clanks.
Wow. And then the assumption is if he made that and dunked it, went up strong, then they would have won the series. But you can't say that because it's always the Bulls. But I think everyone assumes that they would have been in the championship, and it was all on Charles Smith.
Yeah, right. And you're right. You're exactly right. That's another reason it's not fair. It's not. It's far from a guarantee that they would have won that series anyway. I think it's a pendulum, right? Regarding style of play, and I think in the 90s that pendulum swung too far in one direction, and that they allowed the physicality became overwhelming, became too much, to the point that I think strength overshadowed skill and athleticism, and I think that makes for a less pleasing product to watch, because you have the best athletes in the world and incredibly skilled professionals, and for your league, and I think for the pleasure of the fans, you want them to be able to showcase that. And so the Knicks did take the physicality to an extreme, and there were, especially in those Knicks Heat series in the late 90s, they met 4 times in the late 90s, 4 years in a row, and those teams were mirror images of each other, because it was Riley left to go to the Heat, and his protege Van Gundy was coaching the Knicks, so he coached the Knicks in the same style that Riley had, and Riley brought that style over to Miami, and he similarly had a big physical team. His answer to Patrick Ewing was Alonzo Mourning, and so those teams, it was like watching a wrestling match on the court, and there were games that were 77-73 final scores. And I think it went too far, because there was so much grabbing and holding and bumping that guys couldn't get their shot off and weren't able to, like I said, showcase their talents and their skills. And so they made rule changes. They took away the handshake, and they took a hand check, and having your hands on guys in the post and bumping guys in the lane, and running into shooters and stuff like that. And the game opened up a lot, and now you have guys like Steph Curry and Kyrie Irving, who were just magicians with a basketball, displaying their skills without being pushed around or checked or held in place or knocked off the ball or whatever it is. I happen to think, you have people who are diehards either way, that the game is so much better now or it was so much better then. They ruined the game in the 90s. They're ruining the game now. And I think I think all that stuff is hyperbole, right? The game is fine.
Here's another question that people have often asked me, and I don't know the answer. Why did the Knicks trade Mark Jackson? And I know they did pretty well. They brought in a guy like Charles Smith, who maybe they thought would be on the second star that Ewing needed in the front court. What was the reason why they traded? Mark Jackson was one of the best moves that they made besides Bill Cartwright for Oakley. Those were like game-changing season winning.
Yeah. Jackson, I don't think they wanted to trade Mark Jackson. I don't think it was a case where like they were looking to shop Mark Jackson, or looking to get rid of him or move on. I think it was more that they really coveted Smith. They had lost unexpectedly to them. They lost Xavier McDaniel in free agency that summer, 1992, and he was slated to be the small forward, and they didn't really have a replacement, and they desperately needed a forward. They definitely needed a forward, a starting forward, and as you said, I think they thought Charles Smith had averaged 20 points a game the year earlier. I think they thought maybe he could be that second consecutive scorer. He was still young. I think there was a perception that he hadn't quite reached his peak yet, and that he could be that number two guy. I would also add that the year before the Knicks had drafted Greg Anthony in the first round, and I think there was some optimism that he could succeed Jackson at point guard. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't think it was that they necessarily. Jackson had his flaws, particularly Riley was a defensive coach. He preached defense, and Jackson was not a good defender. His feet were kind of slow. He had a very interesting game because he was phenomenal at certain things, but he wasn't a good shooter, and he was slow defensively. And so I think he was deemed somewhat replaceable, but more importantly, they really wanted Smith.
Now, one other point about the X move. You have a little interesting story there where he could have been back, but someone got in the way talking to him.
Yeah. The X-Man thing was weird because everyone just assumed he would be back. He had a great, I was just say great season, but so they signed him in 91. He was there for the 91-92 season, and X was an all-star early in his career and then had some knee problems and it dropped off a little bit. And it wasn't clear exactly what they would be getting, but he could still score. And he had an okay season, somewhat up and down, a little disappointing, I would say, regular season. But he had a phenomenal playoffs in 92. And the Knicks pushed the Bulls to 7 games, which nobody expected. Nobody thought the Knicks were at that level yet. And specifically, X-Men kind of kicked Scottie Pippen's ass. We talked about the physicality of that team. He pushed him around and was talking smack to him nonstop and really got in his head, and he knocked him around. He had a huge impact on that series and was viewed as an ideal matchup for the Knicks to face Scottie. Of course, he wasn't as good as Scottie, but he posed some problems with his physicality. And X was the kind of guy. Scottie was great on the perimeter as a defender, very quick, long arms, but he often didn't have to defend more physical guys. And X could back you down and post you up and punish you down low a little bit, and that gave Scottie trouble. So he was viewed as a great, antidote to Scottie and a very important piece going forward. And everyone just assumed he was a free agent that summer. Everyone assumed he would be back. But the Knicks really put him on the back burner. The main reason, I think, first of all, they had some concerns about his knee. The Knicks doctors had concerns about his knee, which were warranted. X-Man didn't stick in the league very much longer because his knees weren't very good. So it was reasonable concern. And the other thing also, though, is that the Knicks wanted to add another piece or two And back then, you could re-sign your player, your own. You could go over the salary cap to re-sign your own player, but you couldn't sign a guy from another team and go over the salary cap. So for those logistical reasons, they said, okay, X, we'll take care of you down the road. We want to first try and sign guys from other teams, and then we'll re-sign you because we can't do it the other way around. And they did that, and all of a sudden it's like, they kept talking like, yeah, we'll take care of you, we'll take care of you. And then all of a sudden it's like September and training camp's opening in a couple of weeks and X doesn't have a contract. And Red Auerbach calls him in and offers him a deal. And he says, this is the offer I'm making you. Take it or leave it. If you leave this room, it's off the table. And X-Man called Patrick Ewing and said, Patrick, what should I do? I love playing with you. Basically, this is, I love New York. I want to be back. But free agency is basically over. And the Knicks haven't made me an offer yet. They keep telling me they will, but they haven't. And I can't wait. If I wait another week or two, there might not be any other suitors available, right? And there's no one else who can sign me. And Patrick said to him, if they haven't made you an offer yet, then you got to do what you got to do and take care of your family. And so X signed with the Celtics. The Knicks were shocked. Riley was shocked. Checketts were shocked. They thought they had an understanding that they would reach a deal with him, but at a certain point, I think he felt he had to cover himself.
Thanks for spending your Sunday afternoon with me, and let's stay in touch. And I can't wait to have all my viewers. They're already starting to subscribe when they caught wind of this podcast. So it'll be really good. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Scott, for having me on. It's been fun.